these institutions right, if you don't get federalism and republicanism right, what you'll get is some other regime. You'll get tyranny, you'll get oligarchy, you'll get an overly centralized bureaucratic type of government which robs citizens of their ability to govern themselves. And if you don't have people who can govern themselves and take responsibility for protecting their own rights, somebody else is going to do that for them. And when they do that for them, they're not going to do it very well. Today, when we Americans think of the forms of government, we really want to drift off to sleep. Civics class, checks and balances, House and Senate. Wake me up when it's over. But the papers we're studying now address the issues that most bitterly divided the Constitutional Convention. The founders reserved their most passionate arguments during that oppressively hot summer in Philadelphia for exactly these questions of the institutions of republicanism and federalism. They could have finished early, headed off to the beautiful Jersey Shore. But no, they stayed. They became completely immersed not in the cooling waters of the Atlantic, but in those forms of government that we find to be a bit of a snooze. To see why, just think of what happens when you don't get your forms of government right. Think of Iraq right now, or any other troubled country. What are they fighting for? The first thing they're fighting for is the regime. And by the regime, I mean several things. First of all, I mean who rules, the people who rule the political community. Second, I mean the purposes that those rulers and those will have. Third, I mean the way of life of the people in the country. And finally, I mean exactly these institutions, these ruling forms that hinder or help you in your ruling, that hinder and help you in your way of life. They're also looking and debating about the character of the American state, what kind of state they're going to have. Is it going to be big or small? What are its boundaries going to be? How centralized or decentralized, how bureaucratic is it going to be? In Iraq, for example, two different religious groups, two different ethnic groups, combined in three different ways, continue to struggle over whether they will have and keep a Republican regime, and also over how centralized the state will be, how much each of these three populations, Sunni Arab, Shia Arab, and Sunni Kurdish, will govern themselves. Our own Civil War was fought on similar issues. Will Republican government survive? Can a Republican regime survive half slave, half free? How much political authority shall each state enjoy within the federal system? When the founders debated republicanism and federalism in the summer of 1787, they knew they were fighting, this time with words rather than muskets, for their lives, for their way of life, and for the lives and way of life of their children. The Declaration of Independence had announced that we held the truths of unalienable human rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness to be self-evident. They didn't need to debate the self-evident truths. But the Declaration goes on to say that government should be designed to secure those rights. And it continues, whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute new government. That's exactly what they were trying to do now in 1787, having abolished the old form of government under the British Empire, which had destroyed the security of their natural rights. They now needed to go beyond the military victory in the War of Independence and win a political settlement. They needed not merely to obtain republicanism and federalism, they already had them under the Articles of Confederation, but to get those forms right. That's not easy to do. That's not self-evident. Ask any Iraqi. Ask any American today, because many of us are not entirely satisfied with the forms of our government insofar as they've departed from the forms that the founders designed for us. It is a misfortune, inseparable from human affairs, Publius tells us, that public measures are rarely investigated with that spirit of moderation which is essential to a just estimate of their real tendency to advance or obstruct the public good. Therefore, he says, it should not be surprising that the act of the Constitutional Convention, which commends so many important changes and innovations, which may be viewed in so many lights and relations, and which touches the springs of so many passions and interests, should find or excite dispositions unfriendly to a fair discussion and accurate judgment of its merits. Given the failures of American self-government under the Articles of Confederation, both federalism and republicanism in America were at risk. So, let's take him up on his challenge and consider this long ago set of arguments, not because it's of historical interest, but these happen to be perennial arguments on or just under the surface of every political debate then and now. So what he asks, does any government, Republican or monarchic, federal or centralized, need to offer the citizens it governs? It needs to combine stability and energy within the government, while at the same time maintaining citizen liberty, political, religious, economic liberty. Governments need energy in order actually to secure our safety and happiness from external danger, especially foreign invasion, and from internal danger, civil war, civil unrest. France's Third Republic in the 1930s exemplifies a government that failed to secure its citizens from the critical danger, the external danger of Nazi invasion. America of the 1850s exemplifies a government that failed to secure its citizens from civil war, but was energetic enough to win that war. Along with energy, governments also need stability. Stability of government secures what Publius calls national character. What he means is this: a person who never exhibited a consistent pattern of behavior, pattern of thought, could not function in any society. We'd put him away, or at least medicate him, for his own good and our own good. But the same goes for society itself. Publius decries political societies that generate irregular and mutable, that means changeable, ever-changing legislation. Like an individual with a multiple personality disorder, so a government that cannot follow a consistent policy can be said to have no real character. It's unreliable and untrustworthy, yet also very powerful. Well, who needs that? But these four things, energy, stability, liberty, and republicanism, are very hard to combine. Republican liberty means that the people are sovereign. They rule themselves. They're not governed by the few or the many, or they're not governed by the one or the few. To have liberty, you'll want to keep your elected representatives on a short leash, short terms in office. And you'll also want a lot of representatives, enough to really represent the many groups or interests in a large commercial society, enough to faithfully register public opinion, not to ignore or override it. But stability and energy in government presuppose different arrangements than those that reinforce liberty and republicanism. Stability and energy require that the representatives stay in office long enough to see things through, to give us laws that last long enough for us to plan our lives, governing ourselves within a legal framework. Stability and energy also presuppose an orderly execution of the laws, an executive power that's coherent, that has follow-up, that has consistency. To achieve stability and energy in government, We need a number of representatives that's small enough to come to know one another and work together. Too many cooks will spoil the broth. So for republicanism and liberty, you need a large number of representatives, and you need short terms in office, but for stability and energy, you need a smaller number of representatives for longer terms in office. That's the problem with designing institutions for a Republican regime. But there's another problem, as I mentioned before, the problem of the American state. The founders had rebelled against a centralizing imperial state based in London. But they also knew that some degree of centralization, enough to coordinate national defense, for example, was crucial to survival in a world of powerful modern nation states and empires. The answer here is federalism, which in principle sets up political societies that are small enough for self-government, but large enough through their federation, through their constitutional union, to provide security for life and liberty. The problem, the Articles of Confederation didn't get federalism right. The overall national government was too weak, too imbecilic, to use one of Publius's favorite words. Getting right both the regime problem of Republican liberty combined with energy and stability, and the modern state problem of a workable federalism, requires designing a government that acts as a sort of power grid, delivering the right kind and right amount of power to society without electrocuting it on the one hand or leaving it at risk for blackouts and brownouts on the other. Add to this that the different constituent elements of the Federation, the states, differed widely in size of population, size of territory, and in their commercial interests. Add to that the fact that the United States didn't have just one lawgiver, like Theseus in ancient Athens or Romulus in Rome, but many lawgivers from these many diverse states. And then add to that the need to get the Constitution ratified by hundreds of thousands of American citizens, state by state. No wonder Publius tells his readers to think not whether this is the ideal Constitution for America, but whether it's better than the one they actually had. Let's look at the solutions that the founders proposed. First, on the matter of a strong national government. Such a government must have sources of revenue that are independent from the states. Otherwise, the states are going to whiplash the federal government, pull it back and forth. Once the national government has its own revenues, it will be able to exhibit energy, to actually govern in the interests of the people as a whole. Tariffs would be the principal source of such revenues for more than a century. Second, with respect to the American regime, the people must rule. They must control their newly funded national state. They will do so because the government draws all of its powers, directly or indirectly, from the great body of the people, not from some small coterie. No titles of nobility will be granted, no aristocracy countenanced. Also, the people's representatives will have definite terms in office, which will help to ensure their good behavior while they're in there. And finally, and this is a crucial point, Article 4, Section 4 of the Constitution requires that every state must have a Republican regime. That is to say, to put it in terms of classical political science, America will have a democratic republic, not a mixed republic. Republics like ancient Rome and modern Great Britain, the Great Britain of 1787, featured a popular assembly balanced with an assembly that represented the wealthy classes. Although America did have some modest property qualifications for voters, the vast majority of citizens could vote, and all office holders would owe their positions to the people, whether directly by elections or indirectly by appointment by persons who were elected. So you've got two solutions. One is the independent revenue source for the national government. Second is popular rule, popular sovereignty. The third solution, with respect to the American state, is it will have a federal form, but it's going to be a better designed federalism than the one laid down in the Articles of Confederation. The national government will feature a combination of what Publius calls national, what we would call centralized, and federal, or what we would call decentralized features. The ratification process itself was federal, state by state, but ratifications within each state must be done by ratifying conventions called for that purpose alone, not by the state legislatures. If the state legislatures ratified the Constitution, that would be treating those governments as if they were sovereign, rather than the peoples of those states as sovereign over their state governments. That's why the preamble begins, "We the people," not "we the states" or "we the peoples of the states." Further, when it comes to how representatives will be chosen, once the Constitution is ratified, how are your elected officials going to be chosen? This too will have national and federal features, centralized and decentralized features. Elections for the House of Representatives will be national in the sense that the representatives will come together from voting districts, not as representatives of the states per se. There, insofar as the states are represented, they will be represented in proportion to their population as a percentage of the whole nation. By contrast, the U.S. senators will be elected by the state legislatures. That's clearly a federal, a decentralized feature intended to represent each state equally, almost as ambassadors from each state to the nation's capital. The executive, or president, will be elected state by state, with the majority winner in each state getting all the electoral votes from that state. This is obviously a federal feature. But the number of electoral votes assigned to each state depends upon its population, a national feature, again in the sense that your state's influence is determined by its numerical size in relation to all other states in the Union, the United States. Now, what about the operations of the government once it's been elected, once the officials are in place? In other words, once these officials are in place via the partly national, partly federal electoral system, will the way they do their business be truly national, energetic, stable? Yes, it will, because the authority of the national government, its ability to enforce the laws your representatives enact, will extend to individual citizens within each state. Not only will the national government have an independent power to raise revenues for its purposes, but it will use those revenues to hire officers who carry out the laws. So, for example, the constitutional power and responsibility to deliver the mails will be funded by national revenues and carried out by the national government. Now, potentially that could be dangerous. After all, the power to tax and to enforce isn't only the power to deliver letters and packages. It could also be the power to destroy, the power to kill and imprison. This is why the powers of the national government are enumerated in the Constitution. They're listed there for citizens to read. Any powers not enumerated in the Constitution remain with the states and with the people, who are sovereign over both the national and the states' governments. It would be hard to overestimate the importance of this point, this business of enumeration powers. For example, sometimes today you'll hear people say that the Constitution empowers Congress to provide for the national defense and for the general welfare of the United States, which of course is the language of Article 1, Section 8. But that doesn't mean that Congress can do anything at all, as long as it believes it to be in our general welfare. The common defense and general welfare of the United States can be provided for by constitutional means. That is, by means of the enumerated powers given them by the Constitution itself. Office holders must stay within the lines set down in the power grid in the Constitution, laid down in the Constitution. The people who argue that the General Welfare Clause somehow grants powers to the national government simply aren't thinking clearly. Ask them, what does the Constitution constitute? It constitutes the national government of the United States. What does it mean to constitute a government, if not to define it? That is to say what it can and cannot do, and to specify the means by which it can do those things. Common defense and the general welfare are the purposes, but the means are the powers constituted by the sovereign people set down in their Constitution. But, some people will say, what if our national circumstances change? And the Constitution of 1787 no longer fits the circumstances our country finds itself in 1887, 1997, or today. Do we not need a Constitution that stretches, that grows along with the nation itself? No, not really. We don't. Because that would mean that we didn't have a Constitution that actually constituted anything. You would have instead what President Woodrow Wilson liked to call the elastic Constitution, a Constitution so flexible as to allow the national government to do whatever officials wanted it to do. But that would put sovereignty in their hands, not in our hands. The founders had a better idea. They stipulated that to amend the Constitution, which has in fact been done some 27 times, you have a specific procedure that combines these federal and national dimensions. As with all other aspects of the Constitution, the amendment process works this way. A purely national process, if they designed a purely national process, they would have allowed amendments to occur if a majority of American voters approved of them in a nationwide election. This would make our fundamental law, our Constitution, a bit too easy to change, really easier to change than an ordinary statutory law, which at least requires concurrences of both houses of Congress plus the president's signature. A purely federal process would require the unanimous consent of all the states. Publius didn't like that either. He says the absurdity of subjecting the fate of 12 states to the perverseness or corruption of the 13th would be foolish, because a bare majority of voters in a small state like Rhode Island or Delaware could override the opinions of majorities in all the other states. What the founders did do was to allow amendments to be proposed by either two-thirds majorities in both houses of Congress or by two-thirds of the state legislatures. Ratification of those amendments then requires the approval of 3/4 of the state legislatures or 3/4 of the conventions in each state. Congress will determine which one of these forms of ratification will be used when an amendment is proposed. In following the argument Publius puts before us in Federalists 37 to 40, we've been able to think along with him as he teaches us how to think about constitutional government in America. He shows us first of all what the key problems are, the things we need to think about: energy and stability. The needs of any government that really governs must be combined with the architecture, the institutions that keep the government focused on the purposes we design any government for, namely securing our unalienable rights. On the level of the regime so designed, we're looking for republicanism, because the people's rights are best secured by governing institutions and by governing officials who are responsible to the same people whose rights they are intended to secure. On the level of the state so designed, we're looking for federalism, so that the different levels of government, local, county, state, and national, each can govern in its own sphere. Taken together, republicanism and federalism add up to self-government in America, government of, for, and by the people. This is a republic of a certain kind. It's a democratic republic. The people are sovereigns, not monarchs or aristocrats. It's a commercial republic designed for a peaceful and enterprising people, not a military republic like ancient Rome, which was designed for conquest. And in these essays, we see that it's also what Publius calls a compound republic. Compound republic, meaning it features both national and federal elements in one governing structure. That wasn't easy to do. That wasn't easy to bring off. Publius rightly acknowledges the difficulty of designing and ratifying such a constitution for such a republic in the real world and not just on paper. Let's give him the final word. The real wonder is that so many difficulties should have been surmounted, and surmounted with a unanimity almost as unprecedented as it must have been unexpected. It is impossible for any man of candor to reflect on the circumstances without partaking of the astonishment. It is impossible for the man of pious reflection not to perceive in it the finger of that almighty hand which is so frequently and signally extended to our relief in the critical stages of the revolution. Thank you, and thank you to the American founders.